4. Sildar was dreaming of his wife, Gerta. The dream lacked any romantic emotions, for their bed had been cold for many years. Instead, Sildar dreamt that he was humiliating and punishing his wife, something he longed for. He dreamt vividly, and let out small mutterings of contentment as he found in dreams the courage to do what he was too cowardly to do in his waking life. He dreamt that he had bound Gerta to their bed, and as he ravished a young slave woman by Gerta's side, he heaped verbal abuse upon his wife. "Frigid and barren wench! Watch how a real woman pleases a man," Sildar roared. He felt a pain in his foot. Someone was kicking his heel. Sildar opened his eyes. At the foot of his bedroll stood Joti. "Why aren't you on watch?" Sildar asked the man. "Elfgar never came to be relieved. No one has seen him," Joti informed Sildar. "Tyr's missing hand," Sildar swore. Then he said, "Get everyone up and armed." Joti nodded and let the tent flap fall back into place. Sildar was alone in the tent for the moment. He reached over for the slave girl, only to find she and Gerta were not there. His sense of contentment vanished as he realized that he had been dreaming. The inconvenience he had been forced to accept with Lear, for the sake of Lopt, rankled him. Yet he had given his word, and he had no choice but to keep it. The gods did not grant oath-breakers an easy doom. "When I get my hands on that laggard Elfgar," Sildar muttered. He let the threat trail off and laced on his boots. Once he had his sword and baldric comfortably set over his shoulder, he left his tent. Sildar was greeted by the sight of a fairly orderly camp. The Vanayar were no longer sleeping. They were going about the morning camp chores. Lear was standing near one of the women that Sildar had not bothered to learn the name of. It was a different woman than the one Lear had married. They were talking about some matter regarding the other Vanayar. Sildar could decipher this from how Lear and the woman would occasionally turn and look at the woman of which they were discussing. Sildar thought, "I guess he is asking about his new kinswomen and their traits and strengths." The wizard is a soft leader, seeking what it is that will motivate people to listen to him without having to berate them or intimidate them. Such a weakling approach is typical of Southerners. But he is dealing with women. It is probably the wiser course. He is no fool, this one. He said he had lived with the Picts. Mayhap he will be useful in thwarting them. The Aesir warband was less organized. Some of the men were nursing hangovers. All of them were surly at not having been allowed to ravish a captive. They had not been Sildar's first choice of men to go Viking, but they had been all he could coax to accept what was largely ridiculed as a fool's errand. Sildar withdrew the spear point and gazed at it. A temptation to give it back to the wizard as a sign of trust crossed his mind, but he decided against it. However, it would not do to leave the men unarmed while they were in Pictish territory. Sildar paused by one of the carts that he had brought. In this cart were the camp's smithing supplies and extra weapons. He chose a longsword that had seen better days. The edge was nicked in spots, and some rust had collected in its fuller. This was due to his men, laggards that they were, having failed to oil and care for the weapon. None of them now wished to expend the effort to save it. Sildar also chose a round shield for his bondsman. The shield was not the full-size round shield that was used in battle lines, but a smaller duelist's shield. Pleased with his choices, he approached where Lear and the women were talking. As he approached, the magician noticed him first, and Sildar swore he heard the man sniff the air as Sildar approached. "Aye, perhaps I need a bath," Sildar jested. "No," Nier literally growled. "Blood." Sildar looked over his shoulder to where the magician's gaze indicated. It was the same area that he had established his men should watch the camp from. A feeling of dread began to creep along the Aesir's skin. "You will take these," Sildar said, presenting them to Lear. Lear accepted the shield, but when he took the sword from the Aesir, Sildar noticed that the Cimmerian's mane was distressed. "What is it?" Sildar asked. "I have never used a sword. I have training only in spears, staves, and I used a mace once," Lear replied. "What kind of man doesn't know how to use a sword?" Sildar exclaimed, for he thought the Cimmerian was trying to lie to him or jest with him. Instead, a look of shame crossed the young man's face. Lear replied, "It was forbidden to me. I was trained to be a healer or judge. It is a Cimmerian custom that those that heal should not be those that harm. Sildar was taken aback. He had not meant to shame the Cimmerian, yet clearly he had done so. Sildar wondered why the young man was taking the statement as a judgment. Perhaps healers are not considered manly amongst Cimmerians, or that is women's work as it is amongst our own customs. Interesting, Sildar thought. Well, you're in luck. You're amongst the finest swordsmen in the known world. I'm sure we can arrange your tutelage, Sildar said with a smile. The Zengarans would argue your claim, Lear replied with a neutral, matter-of-fact tone. Sildar's smile vanished. Zengara, with its fine steel armor, knights, and masters of the cut and thrust sword, was a major naval power in the world. From all over the Hyborian nations, men filtered into her salons to learn the art of fencing. All men knew that Zengarans were that age's finest duelists. If one of those prancing storks should show up and take you as an apprentice, by all means accept. Until then, you will just have to accept our tutelage, beginning later tonight, I think, Sildar replied in a huff. From behind them there was a shout of alarm. Jyoti's voice called for Sildar to come quickly. Tyr's blood, what now? Sildar grumbled as he walked away. When the Aesir was out of earshot, Jormungand, for that was to whom Lear was speaking, asked him, Did you rattle him with that last remark on purpose? I? Lear asked. Then he said with only the barest hint of slyness, Never. Jormungand chuckled. Then she said, You best go see what they have found. I and Holda will make sure our kin are safe. I will also ask after the progress of the women you treated yesterday and help them apply any curatives as you instructed. Thank you, Jormungand, Lear replied. He hoped she realized he was expressing his gratitude for more than just the concerns of the moment. As Jormungand walked away, Lear caught sight of the trio of phantoms that followed him, standing around him in a protective screen. The red-headed one was watching Jormungand and had an expression of approval on her face. Well, you're hardly impartial, Lear teased the fairy woman. But I like her as well. Then he followed after Sildar. The longsword in its baldric slapped against his thigh and calf uncomfortably. Lear wondered how warriors walked, much less ran with the sword on their side. When he arrived, several of the Aesir were already forming a circle around the scene. Lear had smelt the blood before, when the wind shifted, and had conjectured what he would find. He had assumed that one of the Aesir had stabbed the other in some drunken brawl. He was not prepared for the ruin that lay before him. The man had been torn in half. His chest lay 10 feet from his hips. His ribs had been spread open and the organs inside ripped apart. The blood soaked the ground, and the smell of urine and dung could now be faintly scented. Whoever, or whatever, slew this man where he would not be discovered, that indicates intelligence. And not the animal kind, thought Lear. He gazed at the Aesir's faces, trying to discern if one of them had been the man's killer, yet all of them seemed stunned by the sight. These were men that had seen the handicrafts of death on the battlefield. Dismemberments and decapitations were nothing new to them. Yet now they grimly looked upon their fallen comrade, and Lear could tell that they were inwardly shaken. He knew that the Aesir were all thinking what he was. This is not the work of any mortal hand or natural beast. Lear lowered himself to the body and began sniffing. Composite odors of the scents that Lear expected to find were absent. He prodded through the remains with his fingers, uncaring about the gore. The Aesir were disgusted by his behavior, and 2 of the men moved to stop him. He snarled at them and they paused. Then he quickly peered inside the remains of the man. It took his liver, Lear growled. It? Sildar asked. The day before you slew my the wolves. We were hunting deer. Our kill was stolen from us by the thing that was not of this world. It walked like a man, but it had been misshapen to resemble a wolf, Lear replied. The Aesir guffawed or made sounds of disbelief. I speak truly, Lear growled. How do we know this dog boy didn't kill Aelfgar? Lopt asked the men. There was some grumbling acknowledgement from the warriors. Whenever men are faced with the unexplained, they will latch onto the easiest explanation. With his strange behavior and ability to command the animals, Lear presented them with an easy target upon which to project their fears. He couldn't have. He was with us all night, replied Jormungand. The Aesir had been gathered around the body for longer than they realized, and some of the Vanayar had come close to view what had happened. Jormungand reached out and touched Lear's back to calm him, for she noticed that at the accusation of murder the Cimmerian had begun to tense. Lear stood and, without thinking about it, protectively draped an arm around her back. I believe her, said Joti. So do I, replied Sildar, and he noted the jealous expression upon Holda's face. Very well. Some beast attacked Aelfgar. No, it was no natural beast. There is a monster that haunts this forest. I have wondered why we have not encountered any signs of Pictish hunting camps, or why they were abandoned, and now we know. They fear the thing, and have made its range taboo. Why won't you believe me? Lear asked the Aesir. The Aesir had various reactions. Some scoffed, but a couple of them now seemed deathly afraid. You are describing the warg rite, Sildar explained. There are shamans in the north who practice old, forbidden rites. They put on the skins of animals and take on their power. The wolf and the bear are the most favored, but sometimes the shamans forget to take off the skins when they should, and go mad. But no one has ever seen such a one. They are fables designed to frighten farmhands from wandering too far into the woods. Does this look like the work of a fable? Lear asked. No, but it could simply be a rabid bear, Sildar countered. No one spoke. Lear, have your women prepare a grave. We'll bury Aelfgar and then continue on our way. From now on, 2 men on watch rather than 1. Get to work, you laggards, Sildar commanded. The Aesir warriors broke apart, muttering to themselves. Lop shot a damning look at Lear. Lear stared back at him blankly, and the gaze of those yellow eyes made Lop slink away. Jormungand patted Lear's shoulder, then left to gather up some women to begin the digging. This left Holda and Lear alone by the slain body. Did you truly see a warg rite? Holda asked. I saw what I described, Lear replied. Can you bespell it away from us, like you did to Lopt? She asked. I am not sure. I've never tried, Lear answered. Why did it take his liver? Holda asked. I don't know, Lear said. Guess! Holda nearly screeched. He flinched from her exclamation. After a pause, he said, Cimmerian hunters say that the soul of a beast is contained within its liver. Perhaps there is some truth to that. Why would it want his soul? Holda asked. I do not, Lear began, and at the expression upon Holda's face, he changed how he would respond. Perhaps it needs souls for some dark purpose. Perhaps it finds them tasty. In the legends of the warg rite, it is unkillable. It is the get of Mad Fenrir, set one night to swallow the sun. Do you think you can kill it? Holda asked. Lear could now see the subtle signs of fear in Holda's posture. She was trying not to shake, and her breathing was more rapid than she realized. He realized she just wanted to hear him say that he could kill the monster, that she and all her kin were safe. He said to her, I will not let this thing, whatever it is, harm any of your kin, or you. Holda seemed comforted by that. She did not nettle him with insults. Instead, she took a step towards him and laid a hand on his chest. She rested her forehead against his cheek and remained there for a moment, seeking comfort. Then, to hide what she considered weakness, she backed away and scowled at him. Never come near me again when you smell of another woman. As she stormed off, Lear, confused, looked to the phantom trio that followed him. None of them seemed to have any answers. It appeared that women were such a mystery that even goddesses could not fathom them. He went to the carts where the Vanayar were gathering tools, and took up a pick to help break up the hard mountain soil. Other men, having been berated unjustly by their spouse, would have used the physical action to vent their anger. Lear simply sank into the task. The numbness it brought was a refuge against the self-inflicted pain of not meeting his wife's expectations. They laid Aelfgar in the earth with his clothing and his sword. Sildar stood before the Aesir, and they each spoke some memory of Elfgar's life at Sildar's direction. This done, they buried the man, or rather, had the Vanayar and Lear bury him. Once Elfgar was interred, they were free to begin their trek. Ulf and Joti took to the forward position, while Sian and Helska walked at the end of the train. Sildar was in the middle of the train, and he ordered Lear to accompany Ulf and Joti. With her husband out of sight, but not out of mind, Hulda turned her attention to the woman that had slept with him the night before. She had never believed that Jormungand would not settle for a man's love eventually. Though the Vanir society had no social taboo against lesbianism, so long as the woman still produced children, lesbians still faced shunning from other women. Even with the colder mountain air, Hulda felt the heat of her shame and her anger. She wondered if Lear, with his meeker disposition, might not be appealing to Jormungand. He would be an easy man to lie with if Jormungand was seeking to be impregnated. The Cimmerian would be easy for the lesbian to intimidate into forsaking his spawn, if he even thought he had any rights to the child. This scenario played over and over in Hulda's mind, and she could not endure it. Finally, she moved forward in the line to walk beside Jormungand. "Stay away from my husband," Hulda snarled. Jormungand looked at Hulda with knowing expectation. She replied, "I don't know why you were cross with me. You had no use for him last night. I don't think you can blame another woman for seeing his virtue." "Virtue? What virtue?" scoffed Hulda. Jormungand held up her hands and placed some distance between them, and gradually increased the distance until her palms were a little bit more than a foot apart. Hulda's face colored bright red at the lewd jest. "You whore!" she hissed. Jormungand raised an eyebrow. "Oh, so it is that long? Well, that's good to know. You are a very lucky woman." "You... what? You didn't sleep with him?" Hulda asked, confused. I slept with him, but I only slept with him," Jormungand replied. Unwilling to lose, but also not knowing how to win, Hulda continued walking alongside Jormungand until she could find a verbal weapon that would allow her a victory. "Freya, you have no idea, do you?" Jormungand asked. "No idea about what?" Hulda asked. "You silly nit. You are only the second woman he's ever been with, and you are the first woman he's ever married." "Didn't you ask about that?" Jormungand asked. Hulda did not reply. "If I were you, brat, I'd speak to my husband and listen to him. He's very broken. Someone has abused him as surely as our captors abuse us. Probably the Picts. I heard him muttering their tongue in his sleep. But I think his own people probably abused him as well. I bet they constantly made him feel like he couldn't do anything properly. They'd never be man enough to please them. Never gave him a kind word." Jormungand punctuated her next statement with an accusatory stare. "Does that sound like anyone you may recognize?" Hulda gradually fell behind the other woman and pondered what she had said. Lear, loping ahead of the two Aesir that were near him, began to worry. All along the trail he saw signs of the monster's passage. It had a penchant for marking trees with a curved whorl. He had seen that whorl before, deep in the caves in which Shyle had been a prisoner. Some slain birds and rabbits hinted that the thing constantly ate. Lear imagined it being possessed of an endless hunger, which would explain its behavior. Yet it had the sense to only slay the man on the perimeter of the camp. It has the mind of a man, at least somewhat. More Aesir will die before it is done with us, and perhaps the Vanayar as well, unless I can convince Sildar of the danger. What words do I use? He seems immune to sense, thought Lear. Then he encountered a second example of the mysterious footprints. He found them behind a tree that stood beside the trail they were traveling. Lear sniffed the print, but the sign of Jebel Sog and its animalistic nature had almost entirely faded from his being. His senses were no longer heightened, and his mind was firmly in the form and realm of his man-thoughts. Lear considered placing the mark upon himself again, but decided it may be wiser to wait until he was sure of which aspect of the primordial god to channel. He turned his attention now to tracking the footprints. They were only present around the bases of the trees. No trail existed between the trees to hint at which way the barefoot child, which was what Lear conjectured them to be, was moving. Lear could only conclude the child must be climbing the trees and using them to move undetected. But that was also ludicrous. I should know this. Something about this seems so familiar, Lear thought. In his frustration, he was only making a deduction harder to arrive at. He returned his efforts to detecting any ambush predators or slinking picks. He began to hope that perhaps they were leaving the monster's range. Then he encountered some ground that was softer than the surroundings, and in it the prints of the monster were clearly defined. The tracks were paced out to show that the beast had been traveling at a full run. Lear trailed after it for another quarter of an hour. There are no tracks of any prey that it was chasing. Why was it running? Lear asked himself. The tracks took a sharp turn into the woodline, seeking out harder and rockier ground to hide their passage. A sickening idea began to dawn upon Lear. He had assumed that since the beast attacked in the dark, that it would attack the party only during the night. He had failed to consider its daytime confrontation with the pack might also mean that it had no fear of confronting men during the day. Lear ran back the way he had come, hoping he was not too late. Ulf and Joti watched the trail with their wary eyes. They were not that far ahead of the train of their compatriots and captives. They were advanced forward perhaps only 50 yards. The Asir were maintaining a slower pace to that of which they were used to. The carts had slowed the Asir slightly before. Now with the Vanayard to constantly watch as well, they were only traveling about half as fast as they normally would. Ulf! Ulf! Joti called. What? Ulf asked. You think we can trust the Galder men? Joti asked. Ulf considered his answer carefully. He's a Cimmerian. They don't break their word. He's promised Sildar he will serve him, and I believe that. Cimmerians are also known for despising magicians. If he's different from his kin in one respect, might he not be different in others? Joti asked. I'm more concerned about you attracting a bunch of short men. Keep your mouth shut and your eyes on the woods, Ulf commanded. For a time the two Asir marched at their leisurely pace and tensely watched the road. Hours passed until eventually Joti said to Ulf, I need to relieve myself. Watch for me. Be quick about it, Ulf replied. Joti walked to the side of the trail. It was a narrow track that had been beaten out by picks long ago. In the years since they had abandoned it, the undergrowth had crept in, and now a span of only 10 feet parted the alpine forest. Joti stepped behind a narrow birch tree and unlaced his trousers. Lifting up the armored skirt of his chainmail, he began to empty his bladder. The urine pattered on the ground, and Joti let out a contented sigh. A sharp pain tore through Joti's belly, and he felt inhumanly strong hands cinch on his bowels. With a backward pull, the monster pulled out the man's intestines, kidneys, and part of his stomach. Joti managed a strangled cry and had time to see the large beast backpedal out of the way of the gore. Joti! Ulf cried in alarm. The monster came into view for a moment, considering if it should attack Ulf as well. Then it sprang forward. Ulf managed to plant his feet and place his shield between himself and the beast, with the monster lashed onto the meager barrier. The strap snapped, and the handle of the shield was wrenched from Ulf's hand by the inhuman strength of the monster. A man of southern climes would have cowered in the fear of the terrible display, but Ulf was a Nordheimer. Prepared from birth for a gory death, Ulf did not spare any room in his thinking for the recognition of the crippling pain in his shield arm, nor of the slim chances of his survival. His only thought was to wound this thing before him. With both hands on his spear shaft, he thrust forward, and he was rewarded by the thing's howl of pain. Birds took wing at the sound, and small animals fled. Ulf withdrew his spear for another strike and ducked a blow from the beast. Its clawed arms scratched off links of his mail, but only opened shallow cuts beneath. Ulf stabbed again, this time for the thing's throat, and he was again lucky. Blood flew as the thing howled again, but then Ulf's luck turned and the monster kicked out. The blow caught Ulf in the gut, knocking the wind from him. He tried to stab again, but he could not put enough power into his strike. The monster knocked the spear aside with ease and backhanded the Asir. Ulf slumped, knocked partially senseless, and groped for his sword. The monster reared back its clawed hand for a strike. It roared in pain again as a large bit of its forearm was sheared away, and flew through the air. Lear had arrived and struck the beast from behind. His untrained strike had been lucky and shorn the muscle of the arm to the bone. There the blade glanced off, and Lear stumbled a step. He slashed at the monster, hoping to hit something significant in its twisted anatomy. The sword licked against the thing's thigh, and it stepped back to regard its new attacker. It swiped with its uninjured arm, and Lear stepped inside the arc of the blow. Ducking, he thrust his sword for where he guessed the thing's heart must be. The blade sank deep, and as the monster spun, Lear lost his grip on the weapon. "Tyr!" came a cry. It was Silder's voice. "Uller! Yummer!" cried the other Aesir. Hearing the roars, the Aesir had run to meet the challenge. Now they stood dumbstruck, facing a being of their myths which they had only partially believed. Lear had not a moment to spare. He snatched up Ulf's fallen spear and lanced out with it. A year of watching the Picts had made him a formidable foe when he was armed with their favored weapon. He had even won a duel against Hachkanuk with the spear. When he thrust, Lear did not rely on strength, as Ulf had, but on speed and placement of his strike. Rapidly his spear darted in, and with short hops of the point, Lear caused it to bite into the thing's flesh in multiple places. He had given the beast 5 more wounds in rapid succession when it finally turned and ran for its unnatural life into the woods. The Aesir, having recovered from their shock, fired arrows after it. One of these struck the creature, and before it vanished into the trees. 2 of the Aesir fell to their knees in prayer, offering raised hands to the sky and begging Ymir not to spare them from harm, that they might have an opportunity to slay the monster. Lear could not believe what he heard them utter. Yet he knew Cimmerian men who would also tempt fate for the honor of being a hero, elevated to song. "Idiots, the lot of them," Lear muttered to himself. Then he turned to Ulf. The Aesir did not seem grievously wounded, but from the way his head was lolling, it was clear he would need assistance walking. Ulf, can you hear me?" Lear asked. "Yes. Gods, Galderman, you can fight," Ulf said. "Will he live?" Sildur asked. Lear looked up to see several Aesir standing around him. He told them, "Aye, he'll live, though he should not be walking. After I stitch and clean these wounds, we should consider putting him in a cart or dragging him on a travois." "How can that beast still move with so many wounds?" Mishka asked. "Wounds? It has the Cimmerian sword in its heart, and it still ran," Za'an remarked. "We need silver. The legends say silver can kill it," Yvonne exclaimed. "Wolfsbane! We need wolfsbane to slay the beast. It poisons it," shouted Lopt. "Silence!" Sildur ordered. Then he turned to Lear and asked, "What say you?" "I say we should not rely solely on what we have heard from others, but on what we have seen. We know it is incredibly strong, silent in the woods, and that it eschews the use of weaponry. It can lay ambushes and shows intelligence. We won't slay it with arms alone." "This will require preparation," Lear replied. "Maybe it will bleed out as it runs. We could follow its blood trail and finish it off," said Tar hopefully. Sildur considered it. He thought, being able to bring back the evidence of such a beast. "Clearly we can drive it off if it takes enough damage. Let us travel more cautiously until we are free of it," Lear suggested. "I have heard many things about Cimmerians, but never have I heard that they were cowards," Lopt said with a smirk. He was clearly feeling more confident now that Lear had given Sildur his word to be the Aesir's bondsman. Lopt mistakenly believed that Lear had also sworn not to harm any of Sildur's men. "We have it on the run. Mishka, Tar, Lopt, and Za'an, go hunt it down," Sildur ordered. "Do that, and you are likely sending them to their deaths," Lear cautioned. Tar held his arms out wide in a gesture that showed his acceptance of his fate, and also bragged, announcing, "Then at least we shall dine with the gods in their halls." With that, the 4 chosen Aesir warriors set out to bring back the beast's carcass. They walked with surety and glee. Lear scowled and turned his attention to the wounded man before him. As he cleaned the wounds and threaded his needle, he wondered how he could keep the women alive. He was sure the monster would slay the men, who were far too enamored of glory to take sensible action.